Okay, I promised a video on artifacts, and let it not be said that I'm not a man of my word. So, we're going to be looking at three things today, and hopefully we will be doing so relatively quickly. I don't plan to keep you for more than 5 or 7 minutes. So the first one we're looking at, that I'm sort of slowly panning back and forth on, I'm going to try and lean back a little bit. This is the station sign from the Canadian Pacific Railway station on Quebec Street. So, among the many hats that I wear, I'm the chair of the London East Historical Society, which means that I do a lot of educational work. And I collect these sorts of artifacts in order to use them in neighborhood education ways. So the Canadian Pacific Railway built a railway through Old East in 1887, I believe. Don't quote me on the 7, but it was late 1880s. And initially, for the entirety of the railway's history, there was a station downtown. There was a freight yard out in the East End. And early on, there was no real talk about having a neighborhood station in the East End, but eventually that came to pass. And so the Quebec Street station opened in 1912, and this is the binder of images that we take to community events. And so this is a picture of the station from shortly after it opened. And you can see that, if you scroll down, this is a picture of the station from shortly before it closed. These are the best two pictures of the station we have. You can see that the station sign is clearly visible on the side of the station there, and is not visible on the original photograph. It's possible that it was moved, but it's much more likely that the sign was not original to the building and was added at some future point. The station went in 1912 and served a purely local function. I think initially there were only 3 trains a day that stopped there, all of them local trains from London to Toronto. The station was significantly larger than it needed to be for the traffic it served for 2 reasons. One of them was that it was cheaper and easier for the Canadian Pacific to pull a standard plan off the shelf than to have new plans made that more closely fit the required square footage. But secondly, because the space upstairs, and to a certain extent the space on the ground floor, was used as offices for the freight yard. And if I turn the page here, we have the freight yard immediately, so the roundhouse here was immediately across the tracks from the railway station, and this is an image and another image of the freight yard that the station served as offices for many, many years. The sign came into my possession about a year ago. When the railway decided to tear the station down, they hired a couple of existing railway staff members to do the demolition for them. And the gentlemen in question were told that in addition to sort of the wage they were getting for tearing down the station, they could keep the lumber. I have it on good authority that a portion of that lumber went to panel a living room out in the suburbs. But the sign itself was kept. One of the gentlemen took a fancy to it. And about a year ago, his daughter was at an event that I was doing some presentations at, and she offered to donate the sign to the Historical Society. This is actually something I feel kind of guilty about, because the original idea was that it was going to be displayed at the block party, and the block party was cancelled a month after I received the sign. And so the only time this has actually been out in public so far was at the unveiling of the plaque for Lifespin's building. But that's going to change in the new year. We're putting together a display that will include the station sign and item number 2, this math textbook. I know it says thorough baked bread. That is one of many very cool things about this book. So this book, and I apologize for the lighting, it's a little better. Here, I'll get my head out of the way. So this book was a math textbook from the 1920s. I should pull out the images again because I'll pull out a brief image of Lorne Avenue Public School, which this also is a school which has since been demolished. I mean, some of you will be familiar with the current Lorne Avenue Public School structure, but this is the predecessor structure and was torn down in the 1970s. But it's the structure that this math book would have been associated with. So, for starters, this has a dust jacket, which is clearly not associated with the text of the book, and appears to be entirely advertising. And they're advertising a particular piece of bread. I have to assume that the company subsidized a portion of the cost of the textbook in exchange for putting an advertising dust jacket on the front of the book. So you can see under the torn bit, arithmetic for public schools, and the name of Iris E. Parr is written in the front, along with her address and the school that she attended. It's priced 10 cents. So I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I'm assuming between the fact that there's a name written in the front, the fact that the address 431 Quebec Street is also the address of the man who donated this to the Historical Society, and he says that he found it in his house. So presumably this is something that was sold to the children. They had to purchase it for 10 cents, which in 1920 would have been a fair chunk of money. And arithmetic for public schools, Ontario, so it looks like it's being standardized across the province. This gets really interesting really fast. This looks to me like this is supposed to cover a lot of different grades. It begins with how to read numbers. Where are we? So we're at addition, we need to go back further. Notation and numeration. The symbols generally used, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And it ends with some surprisingly complicated mathematics. The entire thing is clearly designed to be practical, and to emphasize over and over the ways in which the children are going to be using mathematics in daily life. So I assume this is going over several years. It starts with, as I said, how numbers work. Interestingly, it includes, and I'll see if I can find it easily, but it includes a section on how Roman numbers work. Yes, Arabic numerals, but in writing numbers, other symbols called Roman numerals are sometimes used. Those are the capital letters, da-da-da-da-da. Those numerals are used in putting dates on buildings, in numbering the chapters of a book, in numbering the hours on the dials of clocks, and for other special purposes. So it was felt to sort of point these sort of cultural things out in a math textbook. But the bulk of the book, so as soon as they get into addition, they state that children should be able to add up sums. There are points in here where begin at 100 and count backwards by 3s, by 4s, and so on up to 9s. Begin at 97 and count backwards by 2s, by 3s, by 4s, and so on. So they want a great deal of this to be memorized. There's a point, and I may have passed it already, where there's very clearly, yes, practice adding the following until you can add the groups in any order at the rate of 60 groups a minute. So there's a very clear impulse. There's a sort of drill sergeant approach being taken here. There's an assumption that these are things that you need to have memorized. You need to be able to rattle off what 2 plus 4 plus 8 amounts to off the top of your head. And in a world where I have a device that can do simple mathematics like that on my phone, this is no longer so important. It's not relevant whether a 5-year-old, because this would be very young children, can have these kinds of things memorized. But for this, in the 1920s, it was a different issue. The rest of the book goes on through sort of abstract mathematics occasionally, but almost entirely practical mathematics. There are digressions. I mean, this is weights and measures. Depending upon what exactly I stumble across, there's a section in here on how banks work, on how interest is calculated on loans, on how ledger books are kept. Commissions for traveling salesmen. And the whole thing is to be able to get children to do practical day-to-day mathematics in their head. And this is a really, really interesting document of an earlier way of doing mathematics education. I don't know that I think it's better, and I don't know that I think it's worse either. I have days when I go both ways on this, but it's certainly different. All right, we're getting up to 11 minutes, I see by my little timer thing. So I'm going to be relatively brief with the atlas. This isn't Old East related. This was actually given to me by my grandfather and was bought by him shortly after he married my grandmother. And so the atlas is interesting because of its age. Also, I mean, for me, it has sentimental values. There's a lot of interesting things in here. I love this one. This is a map of Africa. And you can see all the the green here is all French. And the pink, obviously it's pink, the red world is British. And so when this was published, Africa was still dominated by colonies. Sometime in, I think, the 60s, 70s, I don't see a date on this immediately, my grandfather pinned a new map of Africa into this book. I would have to 1964. And even this is radically different than the present map of Africa. If you flip through nearly every page of this atlas, there are substantial changes that have happened. There are borders. The borders of Saudi Arabia are still not clearly articulated. Many parts of the world are still identified as colonies. In the Soviet Union, it was still the Soviet Union for one thing. And if you look at names, and I'm not sure, so here this is the sort of city map for Leningrad, and it's still blurry. Will it stop being? It will not stop being blurry. There we go. Sharpened up for a minute. And so a lot of these places, I'm not going to be able to zoom in well enough. Let's see what I can do. Will this work? I have just created a big yellow blur. Darn. Sorry. If I had you sitting next to me, the Soviet Union is littered with different place names. So is China, where when an earlier system of Latinization for the names was very much in place. So I mean, right across the world, there's interesting changes in this atlas, and for me, it's a historical document that I actually reference fairly frequently. Although, given that my work is almost entirely North American history, I tend to reference these chapters, pages, because see, the thing is, I have a very strong interest in railway history. And there's no way we're going to be able to zoom in that far if we couldn't zoom in on the Soviet Union. But all of the railway lines are labeled on this atlas. And this is prior to the wave of mergers that swept across North America. And so companies like the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railway, the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, for that matter, the Southern Pacific Railway and the Pacific, Great Eastern. These all still exist. And this is a neat place for me to be able to quickly reference which railways served a particular town in the golden age of railways. So I apologize for the lengthiness of the video, but I kind of find these sorts of things very fun. Next time I will be doing a much shorter video that will be political, and hopefully that will be up tomorrow. I make no promises about tomorrow. We'll definitely be up by the end of the week, but I'm hoping tomorrow.